The challenge for Ukraine currently is dealing, number one, with an astronomically high number of missing persons. It could be at least 60,000, and fighting a war at the same time.
Identifying these people means understanding the full picture of the conflict, the scale of the victims.
Had we been in there earlier, I think we could have done much, much more in terms of helping Ukraine. We had to start from scratch after the invasion.
In our society, the issue of the missing persons usually associated with death itself.
The family always believes they're alive, no matter what. And I think one has to move forward on that assumption. They could be alive.
So generally the families usually don't know where to go, who to ask, where to give the call, what to do, and it's a very emotional general situation for them.
It's a new world that Ukraine didn't want, but in some ways, this process shows not only how resilient Ukraine is, but its openness to change.
Yeah, Kathryne, thank you very much. I'm really glad to see you again here in The Hague.
Yeah.
First of all, if I'm not mistaken, in 2023 there was this book out from the International Commission on Missing Persons called The Country of Missing Persons. You've been the head of the organization for more than 25 years, and over these years you've seen many countries of the missing persons.
Mm-hmm.
How they are different from each other, and what are the common things that you observe, and maybe what is special about the situation in Ukraine in this regard right now?
Well, in that particular book, we were trying to help Ukraine provide guidance based on other areas in the world. So I think your question is very good. And one of the areas in the world that we feel has really set precedents in terms of finding large numbers of missing persons is the Western Balkans, in other words, the former Yugoslavia, where over 40,000 people went missing, and the governments today have accounted for over 75% of those missing, including over 90% of those missing from the Srebrenica genocide. And that required building the requisite institutions, legislation, using new technologies, creating data systems. So we felt, how you work with families of the missing. So all of these structures that were created, we thought would be a good model for Ukraine's consideration. Now, Ukraine itself had already been in the process, following the early invasion of 2014, and already the large numbers of persons missing as a consequence of that, not on the scale today, of course, but already large, of creating the requisite institutions and legislation itself. So by 2018, Ukraine already had legislation in place and already had a commission on missing persons under special circumstances. But of course, then it had to augment its capabilities following the invasion. Now with 60,000 persons missing, it's huge. So scaling up will be important, but I think the model in the Western Balkans still applies. We're also now working in Syria, where the numbers are astronomical, but in this case, not just from war, but also from a legacy of authoritarian rule.
Time that was lost in Syria, for example, yes?
Exactly. So the time period could be 54 years, plus the conflict, plus the earthquake that happened a couple of years ago, plus migration. But I think the challenge for Ukraine currently is dealing, number one, with an astronomically high number of missing persons. It could be at least 60,000, and fighting a war at the same time. So that means there are ongoing large-scale disappearances, particularly of combatants, while the investigations are ongoing. So I think that's going to be a challenge for Ukraine, and now upgrading its entire legislative system to accommodate the scale. Because things have to change. Of course, as I said, Ukraine didn't expect to be invaded and to have such a high number of missing persons. Now it has to build the legislative and institutional capacity to meet this scale.
Generally, can you systematize a little bit how generally the issue of the missing persons is a part of the international justice in the future to end the conflict in a just peace? Because generally it's not pretty much obvious. We understand that identifying these people means understanding the full picture of the conflict, the scale of the victims. On the other hand, we are talking about the Russian-Ukrainian war. We are talking about the people who are not identified but may be prisoners of war, for example, and kept in Russia.
The main thing is trying to help Ukraine or ensure Ukraine is not only locating missing persons and identifying them, but investigating each of these missing persons cases to a level where evidence can go to an international court. And that's a massive undertaking. And of course, you don't know in certain cases whether a person is a prisoner of war or whether they're missing on the battlefield or whether it's civilians missing. I mean, all of these factors are unknown. So, in ensuring, but ensuring in every single one of these 60,000 plus cases that you have a full investigation that adheres to the rule of law and that ensures proper investigations so the rights of families of the missing to justice, truth, and reparations can be met and secured.
I remember last year when we were talking in Kyiv, you mentioned that this issue of the missing persons, if it's the problem that is not solved, and especially such a large-scale problem, it can encourage another cycles of the violence, another wars, and etc. Can we say that some mistakes that were made in this regard, or just some things that were not done properly in the terms of the missing persons, somehow encouraged or became the part of the Ukrainian-Russian war? Do you have such observations?
Yeah, no, I think I think the reasons for the invasion go beyond this because Ukraine did nothing to warrant this, obviously. So I mean, Ukraine was invaded. So I think this cycle of violence in this particular case, if one were to have resolved the earlier cases, it still wouldn't have stopped Putin from invading Ukraine, sadly. So I don't think there is a relationship in this particular case. However, I do believe now, with such a high number of missing persons in Ukraine, and also the large numbers of casualties and combatants on the Russian side, now we're in a very different landscape, I think. And we don't know what's going to happen, And I think that, part of these investigations are important not only for securing the rights of families of the missing, but also in this particular case, building a process of peace are uncertain at this moment. So I think the best possible scenario for Ukraine now is to do exactly what it's doing, and it's engaged in a large-scale investigation where it's properly collecting data from families of the missing, in line with GDPR, European data protection standards, and conducting investigations. There are gaps in this whole process, which is normal. Because it, again, didn't expect this. So, ensuring better cooperation between ministries inside Ukraine, better methods of collecting data, maybe reforming legislation so that the investigations don't have to hinge on the family instigating an investigation. All these measures can enhance the process and maybe expedite the process. But I hope in the end that all these efforts not only secure rights to justice and peace and reparations, but also contribute to peace.
Sure. When I mentioned about this cycles of violence, I maybe didn't put it properly. Yeah. I mentioned that usually we observe that Russia is, as it uses and tries to manipulate many things, it's also an issue of the missing persons. Yes. In terms of, for example, we don't know what is happening to the many prisoners of war, and they don't allow the international organizations, for example, to confirm their status. For instance, they're not very much willing to give back the bodies of the people who died in the combat. For example, so generally, do you have some clear observations of these patterns, how Russia uses this issue?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely open to political manipulation, this issue. And this is why one has to be extremely careful and very methodical in the collection of data and making sure, again, that it's collected to a standard and that, sites are properly investigated. And this is difficult while there's an ongoing conflict. I mean, in this case, the Ministry of Defense would have to, upload grid coordinates, do all these things. But providing factual, reliable information is going to be, again, the best offense for Ukraine. I mean, making sure that everything, all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed, is, to combat any misinformation is going to be critical, especially in today's world where manipulation of facts is rampant. So, we want to help Ukraine make sure that it is conducting a process of investigations that is to a standard, that evidence can be provided to an international court so that facts can prevail against misinformation.
Maybe it will be a stupid question, but generally it seems to me that in our society the issue of the missing persons usually associated with death itself. So mostly when we are talking, reading some stories about the missing persons in the press, it's usually about how the family is searching for the body of the loved ones who is deceased in the battle, for example, or some similar situation. But generally, as far as I understand, we're talking also about finding these DNA matches to identify the children who were deported and may return back to Ukraine. So what are the other not so so obvious regards?
Yeah, so the person can be missing, alive or dead. Nobody knows. And I think for families of the missing, something I've seen my entire life is the family always believes they're alive, no matter what. And I think one has to move forward on that assumption. They could be alive, and to make every effort to ensure that you find the living. I mean, look at the situation in Syria, for example, after the fall of Damascus on December 8th, and the prisoners were released from prison. In some cases,
the political prisoners.
Yeah, the political prisoners in some cases had been in prison for 45 years. I mean, who could have imagined this? So you never know what the circumstances are. Again, this is why proper investigations are necessary, and I think no assumptions should be made. Basically, I mean, just to help the family and to secure justice. I mean, these need to be the primary goals, and to conduct proper investigations. When it comes to the missing children, I mean, what we're recommending constantly to Ukraine is that data is collected from all families of the missing, regardless of the circumstances. Okay, I mean, categories can be created in the central database, of course. Where were they last seen? What were the circumstances of the disappearance? So obviously, when you're dealing with the children that were illegally deported to Russia, for example, and when you're collecting potential data from families of the missing to try to identify them, you'll have that category in the central record. Now, taking reference samples from children can be difficult because you don't get it's difficult to have the informed consent. So one has to move legally on the back of, what is in the best interest of the child. But we would recommend, again, using DNA in all measures, whether the person is deceased on the battlefield but unrecognizable. It could be an unidentified body, for example. It's going to be critical. Or whether the person is alive, and a child that has been illegally deported. It is necessary, I think, in all of these cases to have a proper record and to have proper scientific proof of the identity of a missing person.
I know that over these years, generally the cooperation with Ukraine started since 2014 in some cases. How was it different?
So we were invited initially by the prosecutor's office in 2014. Now, I should say, although we're an international organization, we don't receive assessed contributions. So we never were able to make the case to our donors to get funding, which is really annoying because had we been in there earlier, I think we could have done much, much more in terms of helping Ukraine create a central record, helping it build this Commission on Missing Persons that was created in 2018. So in other words, we had to start from scratch after the invasion. Some things, we had been in communication, volunteering our time in communication with the prosecutor's office, the Ministry of Interior, for example. So we were trying to do certain things from a distance, but we definitely ramped up our activities after the invasion. So I regret that we weren't there earlier. I wish we could have been.
What are the main directions of this cooperation right now? Because first of all, as far as I understand, the core thing is this cooperation in the laboratory that you have here in The Hague, and you help with these capacities of the laboratory to work with these DNA samples, and also it's the informational campaigns for the relatives, as far as I understand. So what else? What are the most maybe valuable, popular directions? Yeah,
so I think Ukraine has an amazing system in place, as I said earlier, but there's a proper rule of law process in place when it comes to investigations into missing persons cases. The problem is now Ukraine has to deal with the scale. So that means it has to change the way it's been operating. It means that laws that existed before the invasion are no longer applicable when you're dealing with mass numbers of missing persons cases. So these are kind of the discussions we're having right now. So number one, helping to address the gaps in the interinstitutional structure. I think it's very good at the moment. The Ministry of Interior has the lead, and that's where the Commission on Missing Persons Under Special Circumstances is housed, and it's able to coordinate with others. I think that coordination always needs to be improved. I mean, that's just life. It's human nature. There needs to be a good data system. Ukraine has a unified registry, which I think is excellent, but there needs to be a system, I think, across the board, this is my opinion, that is where all of the institutions can input data. So, for example, if the National Police and the Prosecutor's Office are responsible for investigations into a mass grave site, they need to have a field application where they can upload all the documentation from that. In the mortuary, the Ministry of Health, which has responsibility for the bureaus of forensic evidence, need to be able to conduct the examinations of bodies, including cause and manner of death, and to upload that information into a
But do I understand it
database.
correctly? Now this right has only the Interior Ministry, right? So for the to upload all this information.
No,
in the
they
register.
are responsible for the entire process.
They're still developing this
but they need to
coordination,
coordinate with the others, because the Ministry of Health still has responsibility for looking at cause and manner of death.
Yeah.
It houses the forensic pathologists, so it has to deal with the examination of the mortal remains, of the cause and manner of death. The National Police have to deal with the excavation. So you have, which is good. I mean, each of the institutions is operating, in line with its mandate, which is important. But you need a system, in other words, a data system that can cooperate with all these ministries and where they can upload data into a central process. The Ministry of Interior is, managing that, but each one of the other ministries needs to maintain the integrity of its own mandate, let's say, in terms of what it contributes to that process. The other component is, using advanced methods to locate missing persons, triangulating data using OSINT technology, satellite imagery. We also get anonymous information regarding the potential location of sites, which we have to share, of course, because it's the responsibility of the state to conduct these investigations. Also DNA technologies. The numbers are so big that what we would like to see in Ukraine, right now Ukraine has about 19 different laboratories, but we really think Ukraine needs its own human identification laboratory, because these 19 different laboratories are working on many things, investigating many different types of crimes that are taking place as a cause of the war, right? But we would like to see Ukraine have one central laboratory that does human identification. Ukraine definitely needs its own high throughput system. So when you go downstairs to see our laboratory, you're going to see a laboratory that is dedicated to human identification. So Ukraine needs its own, but even if it had its own, the capacity still wouldn't be enough to deal with the numbers. So it's going to need help, and we have upgraded our laboratory to help Ukraine, basically.
What do you mean by saying a human laboratory?
Let me explain.
As far as I understand, these laboratories in Ukraine, they also do, and with the remains of the bodies?
They do, but they're dealing with a million other things as well. So, we want to see let me put it this way, we want to see a dedicated workflow, okay? Because Ukraine is dealing with many different crimes, sexual, gender-based violence, the causes of war, looking at, many, many different, the ballistics and so on and so forth. This would be connected to the other systems. You'd have to find a way to do that, and I don't think that's that difficult. But you need a system, a dedicated system for missing persons that can deal with the numbers, okay? That's where, if you've got 60,000 plus missing persons cases, you need a dedicated data system, a dedicated human identification laboratory. So in other words, a laboratory that only focuses on collecting genetic reference samples from families of the missing and genetic samples from the disappeared person, whether they're dead or alive, usually bone samples. Bone samples are extremely difficult to get DNA from. Okay, that's why you need a dedicated system also, so that you have all these profiles in one system. The profiles coming from families of the missing, or in some cases profiles provided by soldiers that are now combatants that are deploying to the field, because I understand that's also happened, of course, and then profiles coming from the unidentified body, or let's say from a child that needs to have its identity restored. When you have a high throughput system, then you do the matching in one place, right? But then you can dedicate the time that's necessary to the most difficult part of the process, which is extracting DNA from postmortem samples. Now, in some cases, those postmortem samples could be chemically treated because there is evidence that there is chemical warfare is being used, for example. They could be burnt. There could be many, many situations that make it very challenging to deal with that particular bone sample. So that takes time. So having a dedicated process that is dedicated to missing persons can accelerate finding missing persons and identifying them, so that you can dedicate the time to this. So our scientists here and the protocols that we've developed over the last 25 years can help Ukraine, because we've been on the front lines. We've dealt with Mexican samples of burnt bodies. We've dealt with chemically treated bodies. So all of that technology we want to share with Ukraine. We're a public law institution, but the transfer of technology isn't enough. Having another lab like ours that can also partner with Ukraine to dedicate time to these challenging samples will increase the throughput. So our throughput is, going to be over 5,000. It once was 15,000. If you can see, you'll need this type of scale to deal with the ongoing situation in Ukraine.
What I hear much in Ukraine, that for example, the families, they just, because of this decentralization and these attempts to gather all of this information, it's not so easy. So generally the families usually don't know where to go, who to ask, where to give the call, what to do. And it's a very emotional general situation for them. We understand that. So generally, will it make life for them somehow easier?
Yes, yeah. So exactly that. So if you have a dedicated system to missing persons, you have now an address where they can go. There should be online capabilities also to communicate with them. But yes, I can see how it's confusing at the moment. And I think this is where, again, we're now several years into the war. Ukraine is doing an amazing job, but there are definitely gaps, and that's what we're trying to help Ukraine address, so that the families of the missing have real-time information all the time, because it is complex. It is so complex. They are traumatized. They want the person back immediately. They believe they're alive. All these factors are real. And they're broken. Their lives are shattered. So, creating a system, the best possible system that one can have, that meets their needs, meets the constant demand of questions that they have, is not easy. But I think that is definitely the goal of Ukraine, and we're definitely here to help Ukraine create such a system.
Can you explain how this exchange of the information, of the data, is happening between the Ukrainian side and your laboratory? Because is there any centralized register, or there is?
Yes, there is. So we are currently right now helping Ukraine in collecting data from Ukrainian families living outside of Ukraine. So we have teams that go, for example, to Poland, to the Czech Republic, to different countries around the world where families are reporting a missing person that's outside of Ukraine. Through an agreement that we have with the National Police, when we collect the data, it's voluntarily collected. So all families of the missing, voluntarily provide their data for the purpose of identifying a missing person and understanding the circumstances of their disappearance, and potentially sharing that data with third parties, including a court that may be one day investigating these cases and taking these cases to trial.
And you are allowed to give this information to the court?
Yeah. We have made an agreement with the National Police to be able to transfer, and this we tell the family. So the family always knows exactly what's going on, and they have a freedom of choice. They can decide not to provide data or to provide data. But in this particular case, through the agreement we have with the National Police, we collect the data, and in the agreement, we share the data with the National Police. So they're responsible now for the process that goes forward with that, and the families know that. So then that data goes into a centralized structure within Ukraine and is profiled, and again, hopefully matched to samples obtained from the missing person, whether they're dead or alive. So that's important. On the other end, we have been receiving post-mortem samples through a court order, so we're respecting the national legislation within Ukraine, but these tend to be right now exceptional circumstances where the bodies are burnt, again, where they need our technical help in certain cases.
So usually the most severe cases goes to you,
cases. Yeah? But I think, and because that's in line with the current legislation and what can be legally done in Ukraine. Now, the legislation to enable, let's say, a higher throughput, because this is a slow process at the moment, relatively slow, I would say. It's pretty fast, let's say, compared to other areas, and to, the fact that the, invasion was not too long ago. Ukraine is moving quickly.
But realizing there's a general scale.
But the challenges are huge, and we want to make it faster, better for families of the missing. So I think, we could improve the throughput by changing the legislation that enables outside expert organizations like ICMPs to work as partners with Ukraine. Because everything we do, and Ukraine knows this, and they're very good at this, has to be done in line with the rule of law. So we want to make sure that anything that happens fully respects domestic legislation, so that the chain of evidence, the whole procedure can be taken to court with no questions asked, so that we're following the letter of the law.
Can you explain briefly? I realize it's a long story, but let's have it shortly. What is the process? What are the path of the sample, for example, of a bone? How it appeared from, for example, being on the battlefield somewhere in Ukraine and going to your laboratory?
Yeah, it doesn't always come to our laboratory. I mean, this is very rare.
So if Ukraine decides to give it to you, right?
Yes, that would happen through a court order. So there needs to be an open investigation that's conducted by the national police. There have to be a proper investigation, a documentation of the area where the mortal remains were found. All of that has to be properly documented. The bodies would then need to go to the forensic bureau in Ukraine, be properly examined. We have an SOP for bone cutting. And then, of course, there would have to be a court order in this particular case that we're authorized to be able to take the bone sample out of the country for the specific purposes, specified by the national police and the relevant forensic pathologist, and in dealing with the Ministry of Interior. So these are very special cases. But in the future, to expedite this process, we're hoping, we can find a way to do this better. But once the DNA is extracted, all of that information can be shared electronically with our partners inside Ukraine. So the genetic information that's obtained, so they are then responsible for making the DNA match between the genetic profile obtained from a reference sample from a family of the missing and the genetic profile obtained from, let's say, a postmortem sample.
Last year you mentioned that you find some new technologies to match even not the blood, not the closest relatives, but also the another ones. So what is changing, what is evolving?
That technology is called next generation sequencing, and it allows you to make a third generation direct match. Okay, so meaning between a great-great-grandparent and a great-great-grandchild or a third cousin, for example. So that technology is very important, but it's still very expensive technology. It's also very important when the postmortem samples are heavily degraded, which is the case in Ukraine. So I think at some point, this technology will be very important for Ukraine and will have to be adapted into the future workflow of Ukraine, for sure. But right now, it's in its nascent stages, and it's very expensive. Thankfully, we have funding from USAID. In this case, we got it back for our Vietnam program. Yeah, exactly. We also got the funding back for Ukraine. But in this particular case, together with Vietnam as a partner, we're able to have research and development funding because that conflict happened 50 years ago, and the bodies were buried in a tropical soil. So we had a scientific breakthrough. For the first time in 10 years, Vietnam had been trying to extract DNA, including us, by the way, and we had failed. So we had a scientific breakthrough in being able to extract DNA from a hugely challenging sample and to make this direct match. So I think this will have direct applications to Ukraine and many other parts of the world to also be able to identify people that may not have been able to identify before.
We realize that it's a great advantage that this process of identification is happening right now when the war is still going on and the scale is rising. But at the same time, what are exactly the value of this process that it is happening right now? I mean, for example, if we're talking either something happening to these bones, if it lays, for example, for 50 years, or there is still always a chance?
It depends on many, many factors. No, it doesn't necessarily depend if the bones have been out for 50 years. I think we've demonstrated that. But in this particular case, I mean, the climate is very different in Vietnam than the one in Ukraine. But I think these new protocols that our scientists have been able to develop to apply next generation sequencing to these particular samples, I mean, we will publish this. Again, everything we do will be in the public domain. And, in Ukraine, anyone can then use it because it's advancing science for the world. But I think, the limits on what you're able to do depend on various factors. So number one, you need to have currently, because you're using short tandem repeat technology, you need to have families in the direct hereditary line, and you need to have at least 1 to 3 reference samples per missing person. So if you calculate there are, let's just say theoretically 60,000 persons in Ukraine, you would need to have get a DNA match at 99.995. You need to have at least 2 to 3 relatives in the hereditary line. So you would need to have 180,000 reference samples, let's say, at this point. And Ukraine is working on that. It's according to Mr. Dobroserdov, the head of the Commission on Missing Persons, Ukraine has 100,000 reference samples collected from families of the missing. So in the case of Vietnam, making a direct match is not possible because family members could be dead because they died 50 years ago. So that's why this breakthrough is important. The other factor for the through, so we really recommend a large-scale data collection campaign. So that's an important factor. So Ukraine, having started this process early, is really very good, because that will increase the potential of making, high-level potential of good DNA matches at the right threshold. The other thing is, with the bone sample, it depends. But I think in these cases, science is progressing to such a level, and we are in the forefront of that, simply because that's what we do, that it's the probability of getting DNA from increasingly challenging postmortem samples is no longer a factor. I mean, it's becoming less and less of a factor. And I think what we did in Vietnam proves that, and what we've done in Mexico. So we're really on the edge right now of a real breakthrough. Typically, with the current technologies, short tandem repeat, you're looking at between 24 and 32 genetic loci, right? With this new technology, you're looking at over 5,000 genetic loci. So when you're using DNA, we're all related. We're all human beings, chimpanzees, trees. I mean, we're related to everything on this planet, right? Everything. So when you're using forensic genetic technology, you're trying to find the very, very small differences between us. So the more loci you have, the more discrimination you have, and the higher the match probability is going to be.
To sum up, unfortunately, I'm sad to say that we are running out of time. But generally, talking about the state of the science that you have right now and the technology that you are dealing with right now, what are the biggest weaknesses and the advantages of it? I mean, I assume that the weakness of all of this is the political will. We don't see much political will from Russia to investigate, to help Ukraine investigate these crimes. It's understandable. At the same time, we understand that the part of these missing persons may be never found. Like, for example, Ukrainian warriors who died in Kursk region of Russia. We are not sure if Russia will ever give us back these bodies, and etc. So there are many examples. What else comes to your mind in this regard?
Yeah, I think it's the politics for sure. It's always politics. And it's also, and I think that not only applies to the situation of Russia and the invasion, but also domestically, the politics of change, the politics of changing legislation, the politics of changing a way of working, a way of dealing with families of the missing, the politics of transparency. I mean, all of these things are so important to a missing persons process. So, it's a new world that Ukraine didn't want, but in some ways, this process shows not only how resilient Ukraine is, but its openness to change in this particular case. I mean, it's having to deal with a horrible set of circumstances, but it's revealing that it's able to overcome the political obstacles that are inherent in any government to ensure proper cooperation between institutions, to change legislation to accommodate this, to ensure that victims and survivors, families of the missing, I mean, they really are trying. It's not a perfect system, but they're trying, which means to me it will get better. So they're overcoming the inherent political components of this that, would be an impediment to changing legislation, because some people don't want to do these things. But if there's a good reason and you explain this to citizens, why is it necessary to change legislation, to change the way investigations are conducted? Because the scale is huge. So I think
it's their chance to the justice.
Yeah, so I think this is, all these things, it's difficult, it's awkward. I mean, Ukraine is fighting a war at the same time, but the willingness to cooperate, the willingness to make changes to accommodate a situation Ukraine never wanted, I think is, to me, I feel very optimistic about that.
Yeah, let's hope that all of these data will be very much valuable in the courtrooms.
Yeah.
Then. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Yeah, thank you for your work. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.